During the fall of 1965, all 4 members of the Higgins family disappeared from their Yorkshire cottage in the hamlet of Ashworth, leaving no evidence behind. This incident would have been relegated to just another cold case in the local constabulary's archives, if not for the discovery investigators made 3 months later, a concealed chamber under St. Mary's Church. Inside were the Higgins family's personal effects, alongside meticulous diary pages detailing rites the Church of England had outlawed hundreds of years prior. The most unsettling detail was that the last journal entry was made 2 weeks after the family was reported missing. For almost 6 decades, the church has maintained absolute silence on the find, and the Higgins cottage stands empty to this day. What makes this situation even more alarming is that when officials were at last permitted to access sealed church archives in 1985, they learned the Higgins family was not the first to vanish under such strange conditions. This evening, I will disclose the true events that transpired in that quiet Yorkshire village. Drawing from previously unreleased documents and the testimony of the sole surviving witness, who has, after 40 years, decided to end their silence. Before we proceed with the account of the Higgins family and their link to St. Mary's Church, be warned, this channel isn't meant for a casual audience. It is for those courageous enough to seek out the most hidden truths that others are too afraid to share. If you count yourself among these genuine seekers of mystery, subscribe now and tell me in the comments which country you're joining us from. Very few platforms dare to broadcast the narratives we share here, narratives that powerful institutions attempted to erase from history. Let us now walk into the gloom of 1965 Yorkshire and uncover the terror that lay in wait in Ashworth village. The events in that small community would shatter the residents' understanding of their tranquil, pious village and expose a conspiracy of secrecy that had guarded monstrous truths for almost 50 years. Ashworth was a place where the passage of time felt different, where ancient stonework preserved 8 centuries of human history, tucked away in the Yorkshire Dales, encircled by hills that turned a deep heather purple every autumn. It was a home to scarcely 300 people, most of whom could follow their lineage back 5 or 6 generations within the same cluster of cottages. The village heart was St. Mary's Church, an imposing Norman building whose aged limestone tower soared 100 feet into the sky. The church was constructed in 1187 over the ruins of an older Saxon chapel, and local legend whispered that the land had been deemed holy long before Christianity reached the Dales. The great oak doors, strengthened with iron bands now blackened by time, groaned eerily with the wind that constantly blew down from the moors. The autumn of 1965 delivered an uncharacteristic cold to Yorkshire that seemed to seep into the village's very foundations. The trees changed color sooner than anyone could recall, covering the landscape in rich crimsons and golds that looked almost surreal in their brilliance. A lingering fog started to envelop the valley each dusk, clinging to the ancient stones of St. Mary's like something alive. This fog was so dense that numerous villagers described feeling lost while walking through the churchyard at twilight. As though the well-known routes had mysteriously changed in the haze, the church bells, which had marked the hours and called worshippers for centuries, started to sound unusual that season. Mrs. Agnes Peaton, who had resided beside the church for 63 years, was the first to notice. The bronze peals seemed to generate a lower, more profound tone than she was used to, as if the atmosphere itself had grown heavier around them. Occasionally, deep in the night, she was sure she heard the bells chiming at irregular hours, soft, sorrowful rings that appeared to emanate from below the ground rather than the tower above. Thomas Arthur Higgins was a man of unwavering routine. At 38, he had inherited both his meticulous disposition and his role at the village post office from his father and his grandfather before him. Each day at exactly 7 a.m., Thomas would step out of his Church Lane cottage, wearing his neatly pressed suit and carrying his weathered leather satchel. He would walk his 2 children, Margaret Rose, age 12, and William Thomas, age 8, to the village school before heading to his job, organizing mail and handling telegrams for the whole valley. Thomas was a reserved man who kept his own counsel, but close acquaintances described him as profoundly religious in the classic Yorkshire manner, devout without being showy, faithful yet pragmatic. He acted as a church warden at St. Mary's and was there every Sunday morning, making sure the hymnals were in order and the collection plates were spotless. His belief was as constant and dependable as the Yorkshire landscape, a fact that made his eventual fate even more unfathomable to those who knew him. Eleanor Mary Higgins, née Whitlock, had arrived in Ashworth as a young bride 15 years earlier. At 35, she maintained the remarkable beauty that had first drawn Thomas's eye at a church event in nearby halls. Her dark hair, styled in a practical manner suitable for a village mother, still shone in a way that made her seem younger. Eleanor ran their modest cottage with the same orderly exactness that defined the entire Higgins family. Yet there was a more inquisitive quality to her spirit, a fascination with the wider world that occasionally clashed with the village's conventional ways. Eleanor had a lasting passion for regional history and folklore, passing many hours in the village library studying the archaic practices of the Yorkshire Dales. She cultivated a garden full of herbs and wildflowers that many elderly villagers identified as varieties their own. Grandmothers had grown for purposes no longer spoken of in polite society. When asked about her uncommon botanical hobbies, Eleanor would smile and say she liked preserving the old customs, though she never elaborated on which customs those were. The Higgins children were the stars of the village school. Margaret Rose was a solemn, contemplative girl who achieved top marks and assisted her mother with domestic tasks willingly. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's calm nature, though her teachers observed that she occasionally seemed more mature than her 12 years, as if she possessed knowledge that burdened her. Margaret adored reading, especially history and mythology, and she was frequently seen in the churchyard, transcribing epitaphs from the most ancient gravestones into a notebook she kept with her always. William Thomas, called Billy by everyone, was the village's beloved scamp. At 8 years old, he had a captivating laugh and an insatiable curiosity that made every adult in Ashworth fond of him. He was especially captivated by the church, spending countless hours studying the carved stone gargoyles on the outer walls and asking endless questions about the stained glass windows. Billy drew constantly, filling one notebook after another with sketches of the church, the surrounding landscape, and, as the autumn advanced, increasingly troubling images that his teacher found hard to decipher. The village of Ashworth functioned by rhythms established centuries ago. Market day continued every Thursday in the small square next to the church, though the vendors now came by automobile instead of wagon. The pub, the Shepherd's Rest, was the informal community centre where information was exchanged and consensus was formed. The post office also served as a general store, and the village school educated children from ages 5 to 14 before they were sent to the larger town of Hawes for their final schooling. But under this surface of rural calm, Ashworth guarded secrets that spanned generations. The village had always been isolated, not just in place but in spirit. The established families, the Whitlocks, the Carrs, the Thorntons, and a few others, maintained customs and rituals that outsiders almost never saw. These families often intermarried and shared knowledge that was transmitted through specific lineages. Mrs. Margaret Thornton, the village librarian and unofficial guardian of local history, was a scion of one of Ashworth's original families. Her cottage housed books and manuscripts accumulated over hundreds of years, including works the church had attempted to eliminate during different periods of religious upheaval. Mrs. Thornton was a tiny, bird-like woman in her 70s who spoke softly and appeared to know everyone's affairs before they did. She had never married, devoting her life instead to what she termed preserving our heritage. Dr. Edmund Carr, the village doctor, was another member of the old families. At 55, he had returned to Ashworth after medical training in Edinburgh, bringing contemporary science that he somehow integrated with older healing methods his grandmother had taught him. Dr. Carr kept thorough records not only of his patients' physical health, but also of what he referred to as their spiritual condition, though he was never clear about what this entailed. The local police officer, Sergeant Robert Henley, was one of the few figures of authority in Ashworth not linked to the old families. He had been stationed in the village 5 years prior and had slowly realized that parts of village life were kept hidden from him. Henley was a diligent, systematic man who valued fully comprehending his jurisdiction, and his failure to access certain facets of Ashworth's social framework had become a growing irritation. Reverend Harold Whitmore had been the vicar of St. Mary's for 23 years, coming to Ashworth as a young curate, newly graduated from theological college. Over the decades, he had changed from a vibrant proponent of church modernization into a far more complicated and disquieting figure. His study, located in the rectory beside the church, was packed with antique manuscripts, archaeological finds, and volumes on topics that appeared only distantly related to standard Anglican doctrine. Reverend Whitmore was a lanky, slender man with prematurely silver hair and eyes that seemed to look straight through people. His sermons had become more obscure over time, laden with allusions to elder truths and profound mysteries that confused and disturbed many in the congregation. Yet he stayed well liked by certain parishioners, particularly those from the old families who appeared to grasp references that went over everyone else's heads. In the weeks before their disappearance, multiple Ashworth residents observed shifts in the Higgins family's conduct. The changes were slight initially, Eleanor visiting the churchyard more frequently, Thomas seeming preoccupied and anxious, the children growing quieter. But as October continued, these developments became too evident to overlook. Mrs. Agnes Peaton, whose cottage shared a garden wall with the Higgins property, was the first to witness Eleanor's nighttime activities. Starting in early October, Eleanor had begun spending long periods in St. Mary's churchyard after nightfall, often carrying what looked like bundles of herbs, blossoms, and other objects Mrs. Peaton couldn't make out in the dim light. When she found the nerve to question Eleanor about these late walks, the younger woman merely smiled and responded, "I'm maintaining the old traditions. Mrs. Peaton, someone must ensure the proper observances are kept." The phrase, proper observances, was meaningless to Mrs. Peaton, but it gave her a persistent feeling of dread. Eleanor's voice had been friendly, but there was something in her gaze that hinted at understandings that disturbed the older woman. Mrs. Peaton started keeping her curtains closed after dark and finding reasons not to speak with her neighbor, Mr. Arthur Finch, who ran the village's general store, observed major changes in Eleanor's shopping patterns during October. She had traditionally been a prudent buyer, acquiring only her family's necessities and keeping strict household records. But abruptly she was buying massive amounts of peculiar items, pounds of coarse salt, scores of white candles, and what she called specific herbs from old Mrs. Weatherby, the village's unofficial herbalist who cultivated healing and cooking plants in her expansive cottage garden. When Mr. Finch remarked on these strange acquisitions, Eleanor clarified that she was preparing for the harvest season. This made little sense, as the Higgins family had never kept more than a modest kitchen garden, and the goods she was purchasing seemed better suited to ceremonial use than domestic needs. But Mr. Finch was too courteous to press the issue. The village schoolteacher, Miss Sarah Collins, grew more worried about the Higgins children's behavior during October. Margaret, typically a stellar pupil, became inattentive and remote. She was often found gazing out the classroom window toward St. Mary's Church, and when asked questions, she would reply as if waking from a trance. Her compositions, formerly examples of clear logic and correct writing, became filled with mentions of ancient wisdom and forgotten truths that seemed far too advanced for a 12-year-old. Young Billy's conduct was more alarming. The usually bright and chatty boy had become fixated on drawing, using every spare moment to create the same unsettling picture repeatedly. The drawing depicted hooded forms encircling what seemed to be an altar marked with symbols Miss Collins didn't recognize, but that somehow filled her with profound discomfort. When she asked Billy to describe his art, he would only say he was drawing what Mummy and Mr. Whitmore taught me about the old church. Miss Collins tried to address her concerns with Thomas during a parent meeting in mid-October. but found him avoidant and visibly upset. Thomas conceded that Eleanor had gotten involved in what he called historical research with Reverend Whitmore and other villagers, but maintained it was merely scholarly. However, his demeanor suggested he was deeply uneasy with whatever was occurring in his home. The organization that would later be exposed as the core of Ashworth's dark secrets had started innocently. In 1962, Reverend Whitmore had suggested creating a group to examine the historical traditions of the Yorkshire Dales, with special focus on the pre-Christian practices that had influenced local culture for centuries before Christianity. The original group had 5 members: Reverend Whitmore himself, Mrs. Margaret Thornton, Dr. Edmund Carr, Mrs. Dorothy Weatherby, the herbalist, and Mr. James Crawford, a retired schoolmaster who had relocated to Ashworth from London. The group convened monthly in the church vestry, supposedly to review historical papers and archaeological evidence about ancient Yorkshire customs. They named themselves the Ashworth Historical Preservation Society and stated they were compiling a thorough study of local folklore that would one day be published for posterity. Eleanor Higgins joined the group in the spring of 1964, attracted by her enduring interest in local history and encouraged by Reverend Whitmore, who had noted her extensive reading on folklore and traditional practices. Eleanor turned out to be a keen and committed member, offering research on herbal remedies and seasonal festivals that impressed the others with its depth and accuracy. What the public didn't know was that the Historical Preservation Society's endeavors had slowly expanded well beyond academic study. By 1963, the group had started what they termed practical demonstrations of ancient rites, initially rationalizing these actions as essential for comprehending the historical settings they were examining. These demonstrations began innocently: seasonal festivals based on farming cycles, herbal preparation methods used for centuries, and meditation practices they claimed came from Celtic spiritual traditions. However, under Reverend Whitmore's direction, these practices had become progressively more intricate and disturbing. The vicar had persuaded the group that genuine comprehension of ancient traditions demanded not just intellectual study, but actual participation. He contended that the early church had suppressed important spiritual understanding, and that reclaiming these traditions was both academically vital and spiritually essential. By the time Eleanor joined, the group was meeting twice a month, with extra special ceremonies timed to what they called significant dates in the ancient calendar. These observances occurred in a room beneath St. Mary's Church that Reverend Whitmore said he had found during repairs. The room, he explained, had been employed for religious functions long before the current church was constructed and represented a direct link to the spiritual customs of their forebears. Eleanor's zeal for the group's work impressed all the members, but it was her proposal that families should take part together in certain rituals that signaled a pivotal shift in the organization's evolution. She argued that many ancient traditions were specifically created for family units and that partial involvement could be hazardous, possibly leaving ceremonies incomplete in ways that might bring adverse outcomes. Thomas Higgins had been doubtful of his wife's participation with the Historical Preservation Society initially, but Eleanor's clear happiness and intellectual engagement had slowly won him over. She would come back from meetings brimming with excitement about new finds and perspectives, sharing tales of Yorkshire's concealed history that intrigued even Thomas's practical mind. When Eleanor proposed he might like to attend some of the group's presentations, Thomas consented to visit one of their regular gatherings. The meeting Thomas went to in June 1964 seemed perfectly benign. Reverend Whitmore had arranged a talk about medieval farming methods, complete with historical documents and artifacts he had borrowed from various local collections. The other members were clearly well-informed and enthusiastic about their research, and Thomas found himself truly engaged in learning about the agricultural techniques his own ancestors might have used centuries before. However, as months passed and Eleanor became more deeply involved with the group's activities, Thomas started to notice troubling alterations in his wife's behavior and opinions. She began speaking dismissively of modern religious practices, suggesting that present-day Christianity had abandoned crucial spiritual knowledge that ancient traditions retained. She started keeping strange hours, staying up late to read obscure texts Reverend Whitmore had provided, and rising before dawn to tend to plants and preparations that appeared to have no practical function. Most alarming to Thomas was Eleanor's increasing insistence that the children should be educated in the old ways. She started teaching Margaret and Billy about herbal medicine, seasonal festivals, and what she termed proper respect for the forces that shape our world. The children seemed to enjoy these lessons at first, but Thomas noticed they were becoming secretive about what they learned, sharing private jokes and references he didn't comprehend. In September 1965, Thomas decided to speak directly with Reverend Whitmore about his worries. He scheduled a private meeting in the vicar's study, hoping to discuss Eleanor's deepening fixation with the historical group and its impact on their family life. What he learned during that discussion would torment him for the few remaining weeks of his life. Reverend Whitmore greeted Thomas in his study, a space that had always seemed crowded with books and papers, but now felt almost suffocating in its concentration of strange objects and unknown texts. The vicar listened attentively as Thomas outlined his concerns, nodding understandingly and posing thoughtful questions about particular instances of Eleanor's altered conduct. But when Thomas finished speaking, Reverend Whitmore's answer was not what he had anticipated. Instead of giving comfort or proposing ways to moderate Eleanor's involvement with the group, the vicar began an explanation of why the family's participation in the Historical Society's work was not just beneficial, but imperative. He spoke of spiritual duties that surpassed individual choices, of ancient responsibilities that specific families were selected to fulfill, and of the perilous results of abandoning traditions that had safeguarded the community for generations. Thomas left that meeting more bewildered and anxious than ever. Reverend Whitmore's words had carried a hint of menace that Thomas couldn't quite identify, but definitely sensed. The vicar had made it plain that the Higgins family's continued involvement in the group's activities was not merely wanted, but demanded, though he had never directly said what might occur if they chose to withdraw. October 1965 brought an escalation of strange happenings in Ashworth that appeared to focus on the Higgins family. Eleanor's activities became more intense and clandestine, with multiple weekly trips to the church and continuous preparation of materials whose purpose she wouldn't disclose to her increasingly concerned husband. The children's behavior grew more unpredictable, with both Margaret and Billy displaying knowledge and employing vocabulary that seemed well beyond their years. Dr. Edmund Carr would later testify that Thomas came to his office 3 times during October, showing signs of severe anxiety and what the doctor described as acute nervous exhaustion. Thomas reported insomnia, lack of appetite, and what he called a feeling of impending doom that he couldn't dismiss. When Dr. Carr urged him for details about the source of his distress, Thomas would only say that Eleanor had become involved in activities he feared were dangerous for the entire family. During his last visit to Dr. Carr's office on October 25th, Thomas seemed close to a total collapse. He spoke quickly and incoherently about ancient obligations and ceremonies that can't be stopped once they begin. He asked Dr. Carr about the signs of what he termed religious mania and whether medical treatments existed for people who had become certain they were receiving supernatural messages. Most disturbingly, Thomas asked Dr. Carr if he thought it was possible for old evil to endure in locations where awful things had happened in the past. When the doctor inquired what had prompted this question, Thomas replied that Eleanor had been spending time in sections of the church he was sure had never been accessible to the public before, and that she claimed to be receiving guidance from sources that existed beyond the ordinary world. Dr. Carr suggested that Thomas speak with Reverend Whitmore about his spiritual worries, advice he would regret for the remainder of his life. What Dr. Carr didn't know was that the vicar was not a source of assistance for the Higgins family, but the main designer of their destruction. The last week of October brought drastic changes to the Higgins household that were noted by everyone who knew the family. Eleanor stopped going to her usual social commitments and was seldom seen outside her cottage except for journeys to the church. The children ceased playing with their friends and looked increasingly pale and withdrawn. Thomas missed multiple days of work, something that had never happened in his 15 years at the post office. Mrs. Peaton later remembered hearing noises from the Higgins cottage that she couldn't identify. Rhythmic chanting, the burning of substances that created unusually sharp-smelling smoke, and conversations carried out in voices so quiet she couldn't distinguish words, but could perceive an emotional intensity that made her progressively uneasy. On several occasions, she saw unusual visitors arriving at the Higgins cottage after dark, shapes in dark clothing who moved with deliberate quiet and never remained more than an hour. October 31st, 1965, was a Sunday that broke grey and cold, with the persistent fog that had troubled Ashworth all autumn hanging so thick that the top of St. Mary's Tower was entirely hidden. The morning service went ahead normally, with the Higgins family in their usual pew in the third row. However, several parishioners later recalled that the family's conduct during the service had been distinctly odd. Eleanor sat with a look of intense focus throughout Reverend Whitmore's sermon, which concentrated on the theme of ancient covenants and their persistence through time. She seemed to be writing in a small leather diary, something she had never done during church services before. Thomas sat stiffly beside her, his face ashen and his hands clenched in his lap. The children were uncommonly silent, sitting perfectly motionless in a way that felt unnatural for children their age. Reverend Whitmore's sermon itself was different from his typical presentations. He spoke of obligations that transcend individual choice and the wisdom of traditions that predate our current understanding. He made several references to tonight's observance and the importance of completing what has been begun, phrases that meant nothing to most of the congregation, but clearly had particular meaning for certain members. After the service, the Higgins family was observed walking home together, but their movement seemed somehow altered from their normal Sunday routine. Instead of the leisurely pace they usually kept, they walked swiftly and purposefully, as if they had pressing business awaiting them. Mrs. Peaton, who was working in her garden when they passed, later recalled that none of them responded to her greeting, something that was completely uncharacteristic for the typically polite family. The last verified sighting of the complete Higgins family was at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon when Mr. Finch saw them entering their cottage and closing the door firmly behind them. What happened next would only be reconstructed months later from evidence discovered in the hidden chambers beneath St. Mary's Church. Mrs. Peaton noticed that the lights in the Higgins cottage were turned off earlier than normal that evening. By 8:01 p.m., the house was completely dark, something that had never happened before on a Sunday night, when the family typically spent the evening reading and getting ready for the week ahead. When she looked through her curtains at 10 p.m., she could detect no signs of life in the cottage at all. But it was sometime after midnight on October 31st that Mrs. Peaton witnessed the event that would torment her for the rest of her days. She was awakened by sounds that she first believed were part of a dream. Distant chanting that seemed to rise and fall with a rhythm that was both mesmerizing and deeply troubling. When she realized the sounds were real, she went to her bedroom window to investigate their origin. What she saw in St. Mary's churchyard defied logical explanation. Figures holding candles or torches were moving in what appeared to be a procession around the church building. The figures wore dark robes that hid their identities, but their movements were deliberate and coordinated, indicating a ceremony that had been meticulously planned and practiced. The chanting continued for what felt like hours, rising and falling in strength, but never stopping completely. Mrs. Peaton was certain she could hear children's voices among the adult ones, high, clear tones that stood out against the deeper voices of the adult participants. The sound made her feel physically sick, though she couldn't explain why. Most disturbing of all, the procession eventually disappeared. Mrs. Peaton watched as the figures moved toward the church building and simply vanished, as if the ancient stone walls had opened to admit them. The lights continued to flicker in the churchyard for several more hours, but she never saw the participants emerge. Monday morning, November 1st, 1965, began what would become one of the most baffling missing persons investigations in Yorkshire history. When Thomas failed to appear at the post office by his usual time of 8:15 a.m., his supervisor, Mr. Gregory Walsh, first assumed the family was managing an illness or some other temporary emergency. However, when repeated telephone calls to the Higgins cottage went unanswered, Mr. Walsh decided to investigate personally. He walked to Church Lane and knocked on the cottage door, getting no reply. When he peered through the windows, he could see the interior looked neat and normal, but there were no indications of current occupation. The cottage felt empty in a way that suggested the absence was not temporary. Mr. Walsh contacted Sergeant Robert Henley, who reached the cottage within 30 minutes to start a preliminary investigation. What Henley found would perplex him for months and eventually lead to discoveries that would rattle the entire community of Ashworth to its core. The cottage door was unlocked, something that was unusual but not unheard of in a village where most residents trusted their neighbors completely. The interior was spotlessly clean and organized with no evidence of struggle, hurried departure, or criminal activity. The family's personal possessions were in their expected places, Eleanor's purse hanging on its usual hook, Thomas's wallet in the dresser drawer where he always kept it, the children's school clothes laid out for Monday morning. In the kitchen, Henley found proof that the family had prepared and eaten Sunday dinner. The dishes had been washed and put away, and there were no signs that a meal had been interrupted or abandoned. However, he did notice that certain items seemed to be missing from their normal spots. Candles that Mrs. Peaton had mentioned seeing in the cottage, several books from Eleanor's collection of folklore texts, and what appeared to be some of the herbal preparations she had been working on in recent weeks. Most puzzling was the discovery in Thomas's small study. On his desk lay an open Bible turned to the book of Revelation, chapter 20, which deals with the binding of Satan and the judgment of the dead. Written in the margin in what looked like Eleanor's handwriting was a single line: "The old covenant must be honored at all costs." Below it, in Thomas's more angular script, were the words, "God help us all. I fear we have gone too far to turn back." Sergeant Henley spent the entire day conducting interviews with every resident of Ashworth who might have information about the family's disappearance. The picture that emerged from these conversations was troubling and contradictory. While everyone agreed the Higgins family had been acting strangely in recent weeks, no one could provide specific information about where they might have gone or why they would have left without telling anyone. Henley's investigation quickly revealed that several key members of the community were being less than truthful about their knowledge of the family's activities. Reverend Whitmore, when questioned about the Historical Preservation Society, acknowledged that Eleanor had been an active member, but insisted the group's activities were purely academic and couldn't possibly be connected to the disappearance. However, when Henley pressed for details about the group's recent meetings and activities, the vicar became evasive and defensive. Whitmore claimed the society's records were confidential and that revealing the content of their discussions would violate the trust of other members. He suggested the family had probably decided to take a spontaneous vacation and would likely return within a few days. Dr. Carr was even less helpful, claiming that patient confidentiality prevented him from discussing his recent conversations with Thomas. When Henley pointed out that missing persons investigations took precedence over normal confidentiality requirements, Dr. Carr reluctantly admitted that Thomas had been suffering from anxiety related to family pressures, but refused to elaborate on the specific nature of these pressures. Mrs. Thornton, the librarian, proved to be the most forthcoming of the Historical Preservation Society members, though her information was more disturbing than helpful. She acknowledged the group had been researching ancient religious practices and that some members had become perhaps too enthusiastic about implementing their discoveries. When pressed for details, she mentioned that recent meetings had focused on what she called seasonal observances that were traditional in this area centuries ago. The breakthrough in Henley's investigation came from an unexpected source. Miss Sarah Collins, the school teacher, approached him 3 days after the disappearance with a collection of drawings Billy Higgins had made during October. The drawings depicted robed figures gathered around what appeared to be an underground altar with symbols and arrangements that seemed far too sophisticated for an 8-year-old child to have invented. Miss Collins also provided Henley with essays Margaret had written in the weeks before the disappearance. The essays dealt with topics such as the wisdom of ancient traditions and why modern people have forgotten important truths. The writing was technically excellent, but contained ideas and references that seemed to come from adult sources rather than a 12-year-old's imagination. Armed with evidence that the Historical Preservation Society was involved in activities far more serious than academic research, Sergeant Henley decided to search St. Mary's Church more thoroughly than his initial cursory investigation had allowed. What he discovered would transform the missing persons case into something far more sinister. Henley's attention was first drawn to discrepancies in the church's architecture that he had noticed during his initial search, but hadn't considered significant. Certain walls seemed thicker than necessary, and there were spaces in the building's layout that didn't correspond to any visible rooms. When he measured the interior dimensions against the exterior walls, he found gaps that suggested the existence of hidden spaces. His suspicions were confirmed when he discovered loose stones in the wall behind the altar. The stones had been carefully fitted to blend seamlessly with the surrounding masonry, but close examination revealed they could be removed to reveal a passage leading downward into darkness. The passage was narrow and steep, carved directly into the living rock beneath the church foundation. The hidden chamber that Henley found at the bottom of the passage was unlike anything he had ever encountered in his 15 years of police work. The space was roughly circular, approximately 30 feet in diameter, with walls covered in symbols that appeared to be a mixture of Christian imagery and much older pagan markings. The floor was made of the same ancient stone as the church above, but arranged in a complex pattern that seemed to draw the eye toward a central altar. The altar itself was a massive block of black stone that clearly predated the Norman church by centuries. Its surface was stained with substances Henley preferred not to identify, and it was surrounded by candles, dried herbs, and other materials that suggested recent use. The air in the chamber was thick with the lingering scent of incense and something else, a metallic odor that made Henley's stomach turn. But it was the personal belongings scattered around the chamber that confirmed Henley's worst fears about the fate of the Higgins family. Eleanor's wedding ring lay on the altar along with Thomas's pocket watch, Margaret's school ribbon, and Billy's favorite toy soldier. The items were arranged carefully, as if they were offerings rather than simply discarded possessions. More disturbing than these personal effects were the documents Henley found throughout the chamber. Handwritten journals, some dating back decades, described rituals and ceremonies conducted in the underground space by successive generations of Ashworth residents. The most recent entries were in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting and revealed the true nature of the Historical Preservation Society's activities. Eleanor's journal entries dating from her first involvement with the Historical Preservation Society in 1964 through the final entry on October 30th, 1965, provided a detailed account of how academic research had gradually transformed into something far more dangerous and obsessive. The early entries showed genuine intellectual curiosity about local traditions and folklore. But as months passed, the tone became increasingly reverential toward what Eleanor called the old wisdom and the true faith. By the spring of 1965, Eleanor's journal entries revealed the Historical Preservation Society had moved far beyond theoretical research into what they called practical restoration of ancient religious practices. The group had convinced itself modern Christianity had corrupted essential spiritual truths and that recovering older traditions was not just academically interesting but spiritually necessary for the community's well-being. Eleanor wrote extensively about rituals the group had begun performing in the hidden chamber, starting with simple seasonal celebrations and gradually progressing to more complex ceremonies she claimed had been practiced in the Yorkshire Dales for thousands of years before Christianity arrived. She described these rituals in loving detail, emphasizing their beauty and spiritual power while glossing over aspects that might have concerned a more objective observer. The most disturbing entries dealt with what Eleanor called the harvest ceremony, a ritual she claimed was essential for maintaining the spiritual protection of the community. According to her research, this ceremony required the participation of a complete family unit and could only be performed on specific dates when the barriers between worlds were thinnest. Eleanor's final entries revealed she had convinced herself her family had been chosen for a special role in preserving ancient traditions. She wrote about signs and portents that had appeared in recent weeks, suggesting the time had come for the Higgins family to fulfill their spiritual obligations. The tone of these entries was ecstatic and filled with religious fervor that bordered on mania, but it was the discovery of a second journal hidden beneath loose stones in the chamber floor that provided the most shocking revelations about what had really happened to the Higgins family and countless others before them. The hidden journal was bound in cracked leather and appeared much older than Eleanor's records. The handwriting belonged to multiple authors, spanning several decades, with entries dating back to the 1920s. What Sergeant Henley found in these pages would reveal the Ashworth Historical Preservation Society was not a recent aberration, but part of a conspiracy operating for nearly 50 years. The earliest entries were written by Reverend Whitmore's predecessor, Father Michael Blackwood, who had served St. Mary's from 1919 until his mysterious death in 1942. Father Blackwood's initial entries described his discovery of the underground chamber during renovation work and his fascination with the ancient symbols and artifacts he found there. Like Whitmore after him, Blackwood had been an educated man with interests in archaeology and local history. However, Father Blackwood's journal revealed a gradual descent into obsession and ultimately something far darker than academic research. By the mid-1920s, he was writing about communications he believed he was receiving through meditation in the underground chamber. These communications allegedly provided instructions for rituals that would ensure the community's prosperity and protection from outside threats. The journal contained detailed descriptions of ceremonies Father Blackwood claimed were based on authentic ancient traditions, but which were clearly his own inventions. Influenced by his reading of occult literature and his growing psychological instability, the rituals became increasingly elaborate and demanding, requiring specific participants chosen according to criteria that seemed to change based on Father Blackwood's personal whims and paranoid delusions. By 1928, the journal entries revealed Father Blackwood had recruited a small group of followers willing to participate in his ceremonies. The group included many of the same family names that would later be involved in Reverend Whitmore's Historical Preservation Society: the Thorntons, the Carrs, the Weatherbys, and others. Father Blackwood had convinced these families they were part of an ancient bloodline chosen to preserve sacred knowledge. The most horrifying entries described what Father Blackwood called the ultimate sacrifice, ceremonies he claimed would ensure the community's protection, but which clearly involved the murder of entire families. The first such ceremony was conducted in October 1930 and involved the Morrison family, who had recently moved to Ashworth from Scotland. Father Blackwood's description of their deaths was clinical and matter-of-fact, as if recording a routine religious observance rather than multiple murders. Henley's analysis of the journal entries revealed a consistent pattern followed for decades. Every few years, Father Blackwood and later Reverend Whitmore would select a family for what they called spiritual elevation. The selection process was based on criteria seemingly designed to target families either new to the community or socially isolated, in ways that would make their disappearance less likely to attract outside attention. The Morrison family in 1930 had been followed by the Hartwell family in 1933, the Spencers in 1936, and the Dunbars in 1939. Each family's disappearance had been carefully orchestrated to appear voluntary. Their possessions would be quietly disposed of. Their cottage would be rented to new tenants, and anyone who asked questions would be told the family had decided to immigrate or move to another part of the country. Father Blackwood's death in 1942 had temporarily interrupted the pattern, but Reverend Whitmore's arrival in 1943 had marked a new phase. Whitmore's journal entries, beginning in the hidden record in 1945, showed he had discovered Father Blackwood's work and initially been horrified. However, over several months, Whitmore had convinced himself his predecessor's actions were spiritually justified. Whitmore's rationalization process was documented in painful detail. He wrote about prayer and meditation sessions in the underground chamber, where he claimed to receive divine guidance about continuing Father Blackwood's work. He interpreted various coincidences and natural events as signs the murders had indeed protected the community from disasters that would otherwise have befallen it. By 1947, Whitmore had resumed the pattern of ritualized murder, selecting the Fletcher family as his first victims. His journal entries showed he had refined Father Blackwood's methods, developing more sophisticated techniques for psychological manipulation and community misdirection. Whitmore understood the key to maintaining the conspiracy was ensuring community members genuinely believed they were participating in beneficial, spiritual practices rather than murder. The families who disappeared under Whitmore's leadership included the Ashfords in 1950, the Kellys in 1953, the Bradfords in 1956, the Hawkins in 1959, and the Pattersons in 1962. Each disappearance had been preceded by months of psychological preparation, with the selected family being gradually drawn into the Historical Preservation Society and convinced they had been chosen for a special spiritual role. Whitmore's journal entries revealed sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques explaining how he had convinced educated, rational people to participate in their own murders. The process began with recruitment into the Historical Preservation Society, which genuinely conducted academic research into local traditions and folklore. This research provided a foundation of legitimacy, making the group's later claims seem plausible. New members would spend months or even years participating in harmless activities, lectures, research projects, and simple seasonal celebrations based on authentic historical practices. During this period, Whitmore would carefully assess each participant's psychological vulnerabilities and susceptibility to influence. Only those showing the right combination of intellectual curiosity, spiritual seeking, and social isolation would be selected for deeper involvement. The transition from academic research to active participation in rituals was gradual and carefully managed. Whitmore would introduce increasingly esoteric concepts, always framing them in terms of historical authenticity and spiritual enlightenment. Members who expressed doubt or discomfort would be subtly excluded from further activities, while those who embraced the concepts would be invited to participate in more advanced practices. The underground chamber played a crucial role in the manipulation process. Whitmore had learned the space's unusual acoustics, combined with the psychological effect of being in a hidden, ancient location, made participants more susceptible to suggestion and group pressure. The chamber was deliberately kept cold and dimly lit. Conditions research had shown could induce altered states of consciousness even without drugs or other substances. Whitmore also used what he called spiritual preparation, periods of fasting, meditation, and isolation designed to break down participants' critical thinking abilities and increase their dependence on the group for emotional and spiritual support. By the time a family was selected for the harvest ceremony, they had been so thoroughly conditioned they genuinely believed they were participating in a sacred ritual benefiting not just themselves but the entire community. Eleanor Higgins's journal entries showed this process in action. Her transformation from curious researcher to fanatical believer had taken place over 18 months of careful manipulation. Whitmore had exploited her intellectual interests, her spiritual yearning, and her desire to feel special and chosen. By October 1965, Eleanor was so convinced of the rightness of her path she had become an active advocate for her family's participation in the ceremony. The final entries in both Eleanor's journal and Whitmore's hidden record provided a detailed account of the events leading to the Higgins family's murder. The ceremony had been planned for months with elaborate preparations including not just ritual elements, but practical considerations such as how to dispose of the bodies and explain the family's disappearance to the community. Eleanor's final entry, dated October 30th, revealed her complete psychological surrender to Whitmore's manipulation. She wrote about her excitement at being chosen for spiritual elevation and her gratitude for the opportunity to serve the community profoundly. She expressed concern only about Thomas's reluctance to fully embrace the experience, but noted Reverend Whitmore had assured her Thomas's doubts would be resolved during the ceremony itself. Whitmore's account of October 31st was clinical and detailed, describing the murder logistics with the same methodical precision characterizing all his activities. The ceremony had begun at 11 p.m. with the Higgins family and 6 other Historical Preservation Society members gathering in the underground chamber. The other participants included Dr. Carr, Mrs. Thornton, Mrs. Weatherby, Mr. Crawford, and 2 others whose names Henley recognized as respected community members. The ritual itself had been designed to gradually overcome any resistance from Thomas or the children. It began with familiar elements, chanting, candlelight, and herbal preparations the family had experienced during previous meetings. However, as the ceremony progressed, these familiar elements were combined with psychological pressure and what Whitmore euphemistically called spiritual substances. Drugs added to wine the participants consumed at Thomas's. Resistance had been anticipated and planned for. When he attempted to leave the chamber with his children, he found the other participants were prepared to prevent his departure by force. The children, already disoriented by the drugs and the traumatic situation, had been unable to understand what was happening or effectively resist. Whitmore's account of the actual murders was brief and matter-of-fact. The family had been killed using methods Whitmore claimed were based on ancient sacrificial practices, but which were simply efficient murder techniques. The bodies had been disposed of in a complex system of natural caves extending beneath the church, caves used for the same purpose for decades. The journal entries revealed the Higgins family's murder had been followed by a carefully orchestrated cover-up involving most of the village's authority figures. Dr. Carr had prepared false medical records suggesting the family had been suffering from a contagious illness requiring them to leave the village immediately. Mrs. Thornton had spread rumors about Thomas receiving a job offer in another county requiring immediate relocation. The family's personal belongings had been systematically disposed of, with valuable items redistributed among Historical Preservation Society members and everything else destroyed or buried. The cottage had been cleaned thoroughly to remove evidence of the family's final days, and within a week of their disappearance, it had been rented to a new family told the previous tenants had immigrated to Canada. Sergeant Henley's investigation had been deliberately hampered by community members providing false information or simply refusing to cooperate. When Henley had asked specific questions about the Historical Preservation Society, he had been given misleading answers designed to make the group seem harmless and academic. Several witnesses had lied outright about their knowledge of the family's activities in the weeks before their disappearance. The conspiracy extended beyond the active murder participants to include community members who suspected the truth, but chose to remain silent rather than confront the horror in their midst. The journal entries revealed several villagers had privately expressed concerns about the pattern of disappearances over the years, but had been persuaded by social pressure and fear to keep their suspicions to themselves. Just when we believed we understood the full scope of the horror in Ashworth, Sergeant Henley's investigation was about to uncover evidence revealing an even more disturbing truth about the community's complicity in decades of murder. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens when Henley finally confronted the living participants in this conspiracy of silence. Armed with overwhelming evidence from the journal entries and physical evidence found in the underground chamber, Sergeant Henley faced the difficult task of confronting a conspiracy involving some of Ashworth's most respected community members. His investigation had revealed at least 12 people had direct knowledge of the murders, with dozens more having various complicity levels in the cover-ups protecting the killers for decades. Henley's first arrest was Dr. Edmund Carr, whose medical records and journal entries clearly documented his participation in multiple murders. When confronted with the evidence, Dr. Carr initially attempted to maintain his innocence, claiming the journal entries were elaborate fiction created by disturbed individuals. However, when faced with physical evidence linking him to the underground chamber and testimony from other community members, his resolve crumbled. Dr. Carr's confession provided crucial details about the psychological dynamics allowing the conspiracy to function for so long. He revealed many participants had convinced themselves they were not actually committing murder, but facilitating a spiritual transformation, allowing the victims to transcend ordinary physical existence. This elaborate self-deception had been essential to maintaining the group's cohesion and preventing members from developing guilt or remorse that might lead them to confess. Mrs. Margaret Thornton proved more resilient under questioning, maintaining for several days the Historical Preservation Society had been devoted entirely to legitimate academic research. However, Henley's discovery of additional evidence in her cottage, including personal belongings from several murdered families, eventually forced her to acknowledge her role in the conspiracy. Mrs. Thornton's confession revealed the extent the murders had been integrated into the community's social and economic structure. The belongings of murdered families had been redistributed among conspiracy members. The victims' cottages had been rented or sold to provide income for the group's activities, and the disappearances had been used to eliminate families whose presence in the community was seen as disruptive or undesirable. Reverend Whitmore's arrest was the most dramatic and revealing. When Henley arrived at the rectory with a warrant, he found the vicar in his study, surrounded by documents he was attempting to destroy. Whitmore had clearly been expecting arrest and had spent previous days trying to eliminate evidence of his crimes. However, Whitmore's psychological state had deteriorated significantly since the Higgins murders. The journal entries had revealed growing paranoia and grandiose delusions in his final months, and by his arrest, he was clearly suffering a severe mental breakdown. His initial statements to Henley were rambling and incoherent, filled with references to divine commands and spiritual obligations bearing no relation to reality. The trial of the Ashworth conspirators, held at York Crown Court in the spring of 1966, attracted national attention and exposed case details, shocking even experienced criminal behavior observers. The evidence presented during the trial painted a picture of systematic murder and community-wide complicity, challenging fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. The prosecution's case was built around the journal entries, physical evidence from the underground chamber, and testimony from community members who had gradually been persuaded to break their silence. The conspiracy scale became clear as witness after witness acknowledged some knowledge level about the murders, ranging from direct participation to willful ignorance of obvious warning signs. Dr. Carr's testimony was particularly damaging to the other defendants. His detailed account of the psychological manipulation techniques used by Father Blackwood and Reverend Whitmore revealed how educated, rational people had been gradually conditioned to participate in activities they would normally find abhorrent. The process had been so gradual and carefully managed that many participants genuinely believed they were serving a noble purpose even while committing heinous crimes. The trial also revealed the economic motivations sustaining the conspiracy alongside its pseudo-religious justifications. The murdered families had typically been property owners whose assets had been absorbed by conspiracy members after their deaths. The victim selection pattern had been influenced not just by spiritual considerations, but by practical factors like property values and inheritance laws. Mrs. Thornton's testimony provided insight into the role social pressure and community dynamics had played in maintaining the conspiracy. She described how dissent or questioning had been systematically discouraged through ostracism, economic pressure, and implied threats. Community members expressing doubts about the disappearances had found themselves excluded from social activities, denied services, and subjected to rumors damaging their reputations and livelihoods. Reverend Whitmore proved the most challenging defendant to prosecute due to his deteriorating mental state. Court-appointed psychiatrists determined he was suffering severe delusional disorders, possibly present for years before his crimes were discovered. However, the evidence clearly showed his delusions had not prevented him from planning and executing complex criminal activities with considerable skill and forethought. As the trial progressed, the full scope of the Ashworth murders became clear. Forensic investigators working in the cave system beneath St. Mary's Church recovered the remains of 17 families, totaling 63 individuals murdered over 35 years. The victims ranged in age from infant children to elderly grandparents, with entire family lines having been exterminated by the conspiracy. The forensic evidence revealed the murders had been conducted using various methods depending on different leadership preferences. Father Blackwood had favored techniques he claimed were based on ancient sacrificial practices, while Reverend Whitmore had developed more efficient methods reducing detection risk and simplifying body disposal. Many victims showed evidence of having been drugged before their deaths, supporting testimony about substance use reducing resistance and making murders easier to accomplish. The children's remains were particularly disturbing, showing signs of prolonged terror, suggesting they had been aware of their fate before being killed. The investigation also revealed the conspiracy had extended beyond Ashworth to include contacts in other Yorkshire communities. Several suspicious disappearances in neighbouring villages during the same period showed similar patterns, suggesting the Ashworth group may have been part of a larger criminal network operating under religious or historical research cover. The Ashworth conspiracy exposure had profound psychological effects on surviving community members, many of whom had lived for decades with knowledge or suspicion of the murders without taking action to stop them. The trial testimony revealed the complex web of fear, complicity, and self-deception, allowing the crimes to continue for so long. Many residents reported guilt and shame feelings persisting for years after the trials concluded. They struggled with questions about their own moral responsibility for failing to protect the victims. Even when they had lacked specific crime knowledge, the revelation that respected community leaders had been systematic murderers destroyed many people's faith in their ability to judge, character, and trust authority figures. The psychological impact was particularly severe for children and young adults who had grown up in Ashworth during the murder period. Many reported feeling betrayed by adults they had trusted and respected, and some required extensive therapy to process their experiences. The knowledge they had unknowingly lived alongside mass murderers for years created lasting trauma, affecting their ability to form trusting relationships. Several community members developed symptoms consistent with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They experienced recurring nightmares, anxiety attacks, and intrusive memories related to events they had witnessed or suspected during the conspiracy's active period. The peaceful rural environment that had once provided comfort became a source of constant reminders of the horror hidden beneath village life surface. The Ashworth case also exposed significant failures in the institutional systems that should have protected the victims and prevented the conspiracy from operating for so long. The investigation revealed various authorities had received reports about suspicious disappearances over the years, but had failed to conduct thorough investigations or connect the patterns that might have revealed the truth earlier. The Church of England's oversight of rural parishes proved inadequate for detecting and preventing the criminal activity flourishing under Father Blackwood and Reverend Whitmore. The hierarchical structure giving parish clergy considerable autonomy had created abuse opportunities going undetected for decades. The investigation prompted significant church oversight, procedure reforms, and background screening for clergy members. Local law enforcement had also failed to recognize the patterns that should have triggered more intensive investigation. The tendency to treat missing persons cases as voluntary departures, particularly in rural communities where people might reasonably choose to relocate for economic reasons, had allowed the conspirators to operate with impunity. The Ashworth case led to new missing persons case, investigation protocols, and improved coordination between different police jurisdictions. The medical and social services systems had similarly failed to protect potential victims or detect warning signs of abuse. Dr. Carr's dual role as both community physician and conspiracy member had allowed him to manipulate medical records and provide false documentation, supporting the cover-up narratives. This revelation led to new requirements for independent medical verification in cases involving sudden family relocations or unexplained medical conditions. The legal proceedings against the Ashworth conspirators concluded in the autumn of 1966, with convictions for all defendants mentally competent to stand trial. Reverend Whitmore was found guilty but mentally ill and sentenced to indefinite confinement in a secure psychiatric facility. Dr. Carr, Mrs. Thornton, and 4 other conspirators received life sentences for their murder roles. Several other community members received shorter sentences for their cover-up roles and failure to report crime knowledge to authorities. The court recognized many of these individuals had been subjected to psychological pressure and social coercion influencing their decisions, but maintained adults had a fundamental responsibility to protect children and vulnerable people regardless of personal consequences. The sentences were controversial in some quarters, with critics arguing they were either too lenient given the crime scope or too harsh given the psychological manipulation many defendants had experienced. However, the judge's sentencing statements emphasized the importance of holding individuals accountable for their actions while acknowledging the complex social dynamics enabling the conspiracy to function. The convicted conspirators' financial assets were seized and used to provide compensation to victims' families with relatives outside the Ashworth community. However, many murdered families had been deliberately selected because they lacked external connections, making it impossible to identify heirs or beneficiaries for compensation purposes. The conspiracy exposure and subsequent trials effectively destroyed Ashworth as a functioning community. Most residents not directly implicated in the crimes chose to relocate rather than continue living in a place associated with such horror. Property values collapsed, businesses closed, and the village that had existed for centuries began emptying within months of the trial's conclusion. St. Mary's Church was officially deconsecrated by the Church of England and subsequently demolished to prevent it from becoming a morbid curiosity site or inappropriate veneration. The underground chamber was sealed with concrete, and the entire area was covered with soil and planted with grass. However, local authorities found it impossible to completely erase the physical evidence of what had happened there. The cottages where the murdered families had lived were gradually abandoned as their crime associations made them unmarketable. The Higgins cottage where the investigation had begun remained empty for years before finally being demolished in the early 1970s. The village school closed when enrollment dropped below sustainable levels, and the post office where Thomas Higgins had worked was shuttered permanently. By 1970, fewer than 50 people remained in what had once been a thriving community of 300. The remaining residents were mostly elderly individuals lacking relocation resources or younger people who had inherited unsellable property. The village that remained bore little resemblance to the close-knit community existing before the conspiracy's exposure. The Ashworth physical infrastructure gradually deteriorated as maintenance became economically unfeasible. Roads developed unrepaired potholes, buildings fell into disrepair, and the carefully maintained gardens and public spaces became overgrown. The village that had once been a model of rural English community life became a ghost town, serving as a permanent reminder of the horror that had flourished there. The Ashworth case had implications extending far beyond the immediate community where the crimes had been committed. It became an academic study subject for criminologists, psychologists, and sociologists seeking to understand how systematic murder could be maintained for decades within a small, seemingly normal community. The case challenged fundamental human nature and social organization assumptions. The revelation that ordinary people could be gradually conditioned to participate in mass murder forced experts to reconsider their atrocity development and persistence understanding. The Ashworth conspiracy demonstrated evil could flourish not just under totalitarian regimes or in wartime conditions, but within peaceful democratic societies when the right psychological and social conditions were present. The religious case aspects prompted extensive discussion within various faith communities about spiritual authority dangers and the need for religious organization accountability. The fact that both perpetrators had been ordained clergy members using their positions to manipulate and murder their parishioners highlighted traditional religious structure, vulnerabilities previously receiving little attention. The case also contributed to growing awareness of the psychological techniques that could be used to manipulate individuals and groups. The detailed documentation of how normal, rational people had been gradually transformed into murder accomplices provided valuable insights into the radicalization and social control processes that would later inform cult behavior, terrorism, and other extremist activity research. This mystery shows us how easily communities can be deceived and corrupted by those claiming to act in tradition or higher purpose names. The Higgins family, like so many others before them, trusted their neighbors, their church, and their community leaders, never suspecting that beneath their quiet village surface lay a murder and deception network operating for decades. The most terrifying Ashworth conspiracy aspect was not the murders themselves, but the way an entire community had been gradually conditioned to accept and participate in activities normally recognized as obviously wrong. The process had been so gradual and carefully managed that many participants genuinely believed they were serving a noble purpose, even while committing or enabling heinous crimes. The case demonstrates the importance of questioning authority, maintaining outside world connections, and refusing to accept explanations that don't make rational sense, no matter how prestigious or trusted their sources might be. It shows how isolation, both geographical and social, can create conditions where harmful ideas and practices can flourish without the scrutiny that might otherwise expose their true nature. Perhaps most importantly, the Ashworth case reminds us that the greatest horrors often come not from obvious monsters, but from ordinary people, corruption who lose their way in fanaticism, greed, and misplaced loyalty. Darkness. The Higgins family's tragedy serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of surrendering critical thinking to charismatic leaders claiming to possess special knowledge or authority. What do you think of this story? Could something like this really happen in a small, close-knit community? Do you believe ordinary people could be gradually manipulated into participating in such horrific crimes? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this chilling tale and want more dark mysteries like this, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone appreciating true crime stories, exploring human nature's darkest aspects. Until next time, remember the most terrifying monsters often hide behind the most respectable facades, and that our greatest protection against such evil is our willingness to ask difficult questions and refuse to accept comfortable lies.